So there's a new documentary out called The Rachel Divide. So it's about Rachel Dolezal. A big story. Headline said, oh, this white woman, and she pretended to be black, and she got outed as white. Now, a big myth, I guess, would be that it was pretty recently, and she wanted to get a job or something, so she just checked a box and just pretended. But this documentary really is a great documentary. It just shatters all these myths and misconceptions. So it shows how her life started. She was at very fundamentalist Christian parents, and they had her. She almost killed her mother in childbirth. They had a son, a white son, and she always felt that they favored the white son a lot, really didn't love her. And then they were opposed to abortion, so they wanted to adopt babies to keep them from being aborted, but it's harder to adopt white babies. It was easier for them to adopt black babies. So they actually adopted 4 black babies and black children. So Rachel Dolezal, she was growing up in a house where there were these 4 black children, and then the parents and the one white son. And she says, and the other black children, some of them, I'm not sure if all of them, but definitely some of them, 2 of them at least, say there was horrific violence inflicted against Rachel Dolezal and these black children, and just these parents were very disciplinarian and would whip them, and there's scars. And then Rachel Dolezal and then one of the black daughters says that the brother sexually abused them. So you see Rachel Dolezal just growing up in this house where people talk about white people reading history, and they see how white people treat other races, and some of them feel white guilt. Rachel Dolezal is like she had that, but just a microcosm in her home, just her growing up. She just saw these patriarchal Christian white people inflicting violence on these helpless black people and inflicting violence on her. And it's just incredibly traumatic, strange, awful, weird childhood. So for some people, that she didn't get up on a whim and decide to try to be black. It was kind of baked into her very, very traumatic, strange, weird childhood that most of us will never have to deal with anything like that. And then later in her life, her black sister brings a lawsuit against the son, the white son, who she said abused them. And Rachel Dolezal, she also stepped forward and says, yes, I was also abused. And that's when her parents hired a private investigator and started to alert the media and try to out her as white. So it's just fascinating, tragic that you look at, she clearly likely suffered this kind of abusive childhood, grew up, and then her parents, she thought she'd escaped it, and she thought she'd built this life for herself. She had her family, she had her job, she was a member of the community, she had friends, this and that, and then her parents, they get her and yank her down from this and basically the impetus, don't know if it's their fault, but now there's a sustained harassment and bullying of her, and you see it in the documentary here. So it's just interesting how, you escape this kind of toxic environment, and then later in your life, your parents just yank you back into it, and it's really tough to watch. And I will mention the biggest accusation against her is that when she was the head of this NAACP chapter, she faked a hate crime. Now, there's no evidence. A lot of people seem to believe that, though, and if that is true, then 1, it's unforgivable. 2, it's karmic, because now she is suffering severe hatred and severe racialized hatred and abuse, but no one's going to believe her, no one's going to care. So in some ways, if you think that it's true, it's karmic. If you think that no, she actually did receive that initial hate crime, I think it's kind of sad. And then you see her family, one adopted black son and one biological son that's clearly black, and then another one that she just had is, you can say, and she talks about how part of her identifying as black was her adopted son. She never really wanted to feel like there was a kind of adoption stigma. She wanted to feel like if she was white and he was black, then clearly some people might say, well, okay, you were adopted, but she really wanted to feel like there was no kind of stigma whatsoever. She was fully his mom. Now, you may believe that, you may not. Now, I'll address the biggest criticisms that I think are fair against her, and then all the criticisms that are completely unfair. But I think Melissa Harris Perry, who I don't always agree, certainly don't always agree with, I thought she was really brave in her stance on this, and she said it really well, that you're going to look at her and you can either see a faker and a fraud and a poser, or you can see someone who had a very traumatic life, very complicated life, and tried her best to deal with and navigate her weird, abusive childhood, her being a single mother, being a parent of an adopted child, and tried to navigate this situation that most of us will never have to deal with, or like I say, you can just see a faker and a fraud. What are fair complaints? Criticisms? I think the lesson, the takeaway is if you're born into a group and you run from that and pretend and lie that you're not a part of that group, that limits your ability to actually fight against the negative aspects of that group that you claim to be running from. So if you're born into an organization, a group, and you don't agree with some things that group has done or continues to do, the best way for you to fight against those injustices is to remain in that group and not lie about pretending to not be a part of that group. So that's the takeaway. Other complaints about her, I think that there's this very powerful, one of her black siblings says the number one goal of a parent should be to give your kids a childhood they don't have to recover from. And I think that some of her actions, continuing to have Twitter, continuing to be on Twitter, continuing to put out a book, things like that, she's failing at that test that one of her siblings said is the test where she may really want to still be involved in activism, and then there's the delusion where she seems to think the cause needs her, the movement needs her. Trump is in the presidency, so the movement just needs her, when it doesn't. Yes, everyone should act like every single person makes a difference, and if any one person doesn't fight injustice, then the whole cause will fail. But that's not true. One person is not going to make a difference. With her, there's extenuating circumstances where she could stay home from the fight, and there would be no problem with that, and then it wouldn't drag her kids into it even more. So it seems like either out of some delusional complex where she feels the need to save people and help people, or just being narcissistic or loving attention, she seemed to continue to kind of put herself in the spotlight and not just walk away. And I get that it's hard, because if she deleted her Twitter, just admitted that she was white, it would be her losing and failing, and it would be her giving up. And there's this heartbreaking scene where she talks about that time in her life when she was leading these Black Lives Matter protests and being the head of the NAACP, and she had her black family, and she felt authentic and true, and she was happy. That was the happiest moments of her life. I'm sure she was living her dream. And if she admits that she's white and deletes her Twitter and gives up her activism and just goes and gets a job at a hardware store or something, she's admitting that she will never be as happy as she was at that moment. She will never be living authentic to her again. So it's tough for her to do that. And I would say she should, for the sake of her kids, that she should do that. But I understand that it's difficult. And I think it's a little more than her just being just an attention seeker. And then last criticism that I think is fair, she doesn't always come across well, especially with interviews with the media. Now, with the media, I think she's been treated incredibly unfairly, unforgivably by the media. So her defensiveness, I understand, but there's one time where she's giving a talk and one of the women in the crowd says, well, you're not black because you didn't go through the initiation process. And she says very flippantly, well, what initiation process? That just, I don't know if that was out of context or something, but I can't believe she would say something like that and be so dismissive when it's not a good argument, this initiation process argument. It's not a good argument, but nonetheless, you should have more empathy, because clearly that person is speaking from a position of hurt, so you should have more empathy. Anyways, what are the bad arguments? I'll start with that one. The idea that there's an initiation process. So Caitlyn Jenner, she transitioned when she was very old, so she never went through all this oppression that women face. She had a lot of privilege as not just a man, but as an athlete, as someone who's very successful. So lived a whole life of privilege and then transitioned late in life. Does that mean she's not allowed to transition as not a real woman? Now, I have to immediately address people who say, oh, it's not fair to make the comparison. There's no argument for why. There's no principles, and that's what I'll get to, where with the left right now, it's just identity politics, and it's just whoever has more power and whoever has more credibility and more clout. Now, the best example of this, there was a Guardian article, everyone wrote their definitive article, after the story broke, and the Guardian, big publication, and they had on someone who said, the takeaway was, I'm a trans black woman, so therefore I know she's a liar and she's not black. There's no argument. It was just, let's have on someone who has the most credibility and the most power within our movement. They'll give their pronouncement, and then we'll all follow that, rather than them having different arguments and collating them and different points of view, or looking through different articles and saying, this is the best take. This has the best arguments. We're going to use this one. No, it's let's find the most authoritative person on this issue. They can tell us what the position is, and we'll all gather around that. So if you make the argument that sex and gender, those are social constructs, but race is biological, that's, again, with race, there's so many different races, there's so much overlap, there's albino blacks, there's so much going on where with sex, not gender, but with sex, there's about half people that are male, there's about half people that are female, and then there's a tiny bit that are intersex. And then there's people who feel like they're born in the wrong gender and want to switch. That's so, for you to say that is a social construct, but race, all these different races that exist and all the overlap and all the continuums that exist, to say that is, you have to say they're either both social constructs, or you could argue certainly that sex, not gender, but sex, that's biological versus race being a social construct. You can't argue that sex is more of a social construct than race. That's just crazy. So there's no principles for saying that one's okay and not the other, except they're transgender people. They have more power within the movement. They have more of a voice. Rachel Dolezal had no one saying it. No one supports her. People on the right, they don't like people who have self-hate and aren't proud of who they are and proud of their own group. So she had no support on the right. She had no support on the left. So she had no one to support her, except Melissa Harris Perry is like the one person that came out and supported her, which is why I give her some credit. And then the argument that because she's white and she pretends to be black, she's elevated and she makes money and profits off of it, while actual black people don't. She has no job. Her book didn't sell. She got invited on a few news stations. They largely either patronized her or outright mocked her, and then she goes back to her miserable existence. So she's not profiting off of it. People say it's a persona, something she just tries on, uses in certain situations. No, it was for decades her hobby, her family, her job, her entire life. There was no persona. This wasn't something she crafted and then discarded. This wasn't something she would use occasionally. No, this was her entire life for her entire life. Right from when she was a teenager, she seems to start developing this. So there's no persona aspect. And one person says he was black, and he says, well, if I pretended to be white, I wouldn't get any media attention. So that's biased. No, but if the head of the KKK, if the head of a white advocacy organization turned out to be black, that would get exactly the same amount of attention. And also the attention that she's got is 100% negative and has ruined his life. So it's just, it's a bad argument on multiple levels. And then there's the argument, well, white people can pass for black people can't pass for white people, therefore we don't all have equal access to this racial fluidity, therefore it's wrong. Now, this is not true. Not all white people can pass for black. If you're a man and you have pasty white skin, you can tell people you're black, but no one's going to treat you black, and you can't wear black makeup and pretend you're black. So not all white people can pretend they're black, and many black people can pretend they're white and have. Now, the only argument that I think is a fair argument is white people who pretend or black people that pretend they're white, they're doing so to escape a kind of systemic oppression that's very different than the reasons why a white person might pretend to be black. But in Rachel Dolezal's case, I think there clearly was, you look at her and you look at how she conducts herself, you look at her past, there clearly is trauma and oppression. If it was just an ordinary person that decided, you know what, my favorite race is black. I like that race the most. I want to be that race. I'm going to start pretending I am that race. You could make that argument that I just talked about against that person, but for Rachel Dolezal, who's had such a fraught life, I think that to make the argument that, well, when black people do it, it's out of a kind of trying to escape oppression, and there's a kind of pain there, that with her there was just this choice. I don't think it was just a whim. There's clearly some kind of severe trauma there that led her to make that choice, which, again, you could say it's wrong, but I think that you could have some empathy for it. Now, why is this important to talk about? I think that watching this documentary and then reading a few of the articles that are the definitive articles, that all the other articles, they link to this one, and they say, if you want to know why she's not black, if you want to know why this is so offensive, just read this article. You read this article, it's by The Stranger, and you realize a couple things. One, how big identity politics are, and identity politics growing on the right for sure with white identity politics, but they've been growing on the left for 50 or so odd years, and I think that now they are the dominant politics on the left, where what identity politics means is there aren't these principles, these abstract principles that you base your ideology around, and you argue with other people about these principles being the right ones and these principles are consistent. No, it's you pick a group and you promote policies that promote your group, maybe at the expense of other groups, but you want to improve the position of your group in the world. So when you look at an issue, you don't compare them to any kind of principles, to any kind of definitions, to any kind of grounding. No, you just look at, will this improve my group's standing in society or not? It's just power. It's just about maximizing the power of your group. And that's why there's no definitions, because definitions limit your ability to inflict your will upon the world. As soon as you define something, it's hard to use. So a lot of articles, they say this is an example of white privilege, which is fine. But then they argue that it's white supremacy, and they use it. Say Rachel Dolezal, they called Rachel Dolezal. They don't call her a white supremacist, but they just say she's just an example of white supremacy. So white supremacy, that goes farther than white separatism, white nationalism. White supremacy is only the farthest right wing, the neo-Nazis, pro-Hitler, only the fringe of the fringe call themselves white supremacists. That white supremacy is hate. Is white people being genetically superior. It's white people inflicting their dominance on the world and spreading throughout the world. Now, those neo-Nazi people, would they want a white woman to pretend to be black, make her hair kinky, darken her skin, date and marry black men, raise black children, and teach African studies? No, they would kill her and torture her for that. That's not an exaggeration. They would actually, people were that hateful and that far on the right wing, they would look at what she did and they are, and that's a lot of the hate she gets is from people on the right wing. Now they would kill her over that. So if you say that she's an example of white supremacy, you've removed the term white supremacy from any. White supremacy now has nothing to do with white supremacists. It's just this abstract term that you can use any racial behavior that's kind of shitty. You can say, well, that's white supremacy. And now all these terms, bigotry, racism, white supremacy, white privilege, none of these terms really mean anything. There's no distinction between them. You can use any term. If you have something that's kind of shitty behavior, the shitty racial behavior, whether you call it bigotry or racism or white privilege or white supremacy, it's just how many characters do you have in your tweet, which is gonna play better with the audience. So her writing in The Stranger, she's able to get away. It's kind of an indie thing. She's able to get away with using the term white supremacy. If she was maybe giving a talk at Google and she was talking to a more general audience, she might use the term white privilege because she knows that white supremacy, she couldn't really get away with that. So you see, it has nothing to do with the definitions, having actual definitions and lining up with reality. No, it's just whatever you're able to get away with and whatever you have enough clout and enough credibility to get away with. And to understand why, when you're dealing with identity politics, you never want to actually have any definitions for things. It's exactly situations like this. So when you have white identity politics, to argue against that, you just say race is a social construct. You just say, well, it makes no sense to have any kind of white pride, white identity. White is just all these different ethnicities that we happen to categorize as white. So you argue that, race is a social construct that's sacrosanct on the left, or at least it has been as a belief. But now when Rachel Dolezal comes along and just takes that idea to its logical conclusion, then you just go the completely other way and say, absolutely not. Race is not. What were you born? What are you biologically? Let's see the DNA test. And all of a sudden, the people on the left become the most strident racial biology. It's only about blood so you see, you have these different definitions of things, and whichever situation you're in, whichever group you want to attack, whichever group you want to promote, you just use whichever definition is useful. You have to understand identity politics, and then also left and right as terms. There's traits that are more common with people who identify on the left. So one is, what are we going to do with criminals? Are we going to punish them and lock them up? Or people on the left they say, we need to show compassion and forgiveness. And if we just show understanding and try to help them, we're going to have less crime or maybe no crime. People on the right, on the other hand, they believe that no evil exists and we have to fight it, and we need deterrence and we need punishment, and we need sometimes violence, and you have to fight evil rather than just understand it and just forgive it. So neither of these views are correct. You need a balance, and you need to balance these two forces. And if we balance these forces and both work with both methods, punishment and forgiveness, eventually we'll work towards a better world. So that's an honest, so people who are honestly, they have this compassion and they believe forgiveness and turning the other cheek, that's the best way to help people. You could call them, that's a trait more found on the left. But that's very different than what we call the left wing and what makes up the left wing in America, let's say. There's a ton of people on the left wing who don't have an ounce of compassion or caring or forgiveness in their heart. They just happen to be born into an oppressed group and therefore on the left, but there's nothing left wing about them. They're probably nationalists. They probably have a lot of pride in themselves. They're tribalists. They have pride in their group. They have out-group bigotry, and they see people outside their group as a monolith. They have all these traits that are associated with the worst aspects of the right. They just happen to be born on the left. They're bigots who happen to be born on the right side. And in some sense, that makes their bigotry better. It does. If you're born into an oppressed group, your bigotry is going to have less of a negative impact on the world than if you're born into a dominant group. Your bigotry is going to be worse. But you're still a bigot, and you don't have to act like these people have any compassion when they don't. So that article, I'll go back to that article. Read the article on The Stranger about Rachel Dolezal, and you'll see just pure naked hatred, and then when you have no principles and it's just identity politics, the backlash, it's not proportional to anything. So Caitlyn Jenner, who's done some pushback, but is largely a hero and untouchable on the media circuit, very inspirational to a lot of people, but has never done anything to go out and help other people, has largely been focused on herself, which is fine, but has never gone out and tried to help other people, and made those comments about being a Republican and being a Trump supporter, and it's got some pushback, but largely is seen as a hero. Rachel Dolezal is seen as a villain who actually did go out and go to protests and march and be with a bullhorn and talk about body cameras and talk about all these issues. Now you could say she shouldn't have done that and pretended to be something she wasn't. That's fine, but does that make her a way worse person than someone who doesn't care about these issues at all and just sits on the sidelines, apathetic, and doesn't care? If you're someone who's criticizing Rachel Dolezal, but you think the issues that she was fighting for are important, is she worse in your mind than someone who never does anything to fix these issues, or the half of the country that is opposed to you on these issues and actively is working against you on these issues? So again, it's all about social media likes and what's popular and what's snappy and what can be memed and all the same. And you see all the same memes that are used and weaponized against people who are trans. People on the left wing, with no shame, they will pick up these and just use them against Rachel Dolezal and say, oh, I identify as someone who read her book, rather than actually reading it. Like, those are just the same memes that cause so much pain to a group that you claim to care about. And you're so quick to grab those and throw them around at someone else. And this just shows the convergence of social media mobs and a media, establishment media, who has no standards and no integrity and will just follow on and latch onto the mob for the news cycle, get clicks, and then spit the person out. And you see Rachel Dolezal, she goes on some talk show, and one of the women on the talk show, Rachel Dolezal says, oh, I'm about to have a child. And the woman on the talk show is like, oh, the child's going to be black, right? Ha. Like, we've seen in the documentary, her kids, including her biological kid, couldn't be more black. So again, it's just the arrogance of the people that sit on this talk show. Someone comes on the show, they know nothing about that person, their struggle, what they've been through. They make a few cheap jokes about something they understand nothing about, and then say bye to that person. Rachel Dolezal goes back to her horrible, miserable existence, and you go back to sitting with your wealth and your opulence, not doing anything to fix these issues. Again, the balls on these media people who live their whole lives not doing anything for any kind of social change and just live in their wealth and their privilege, to go and make fun of someone like Rachel Dolezal, who, say what you will about her, she did actually try to fix some issues and screwed up, obviously, in fixing these issues, but just the arrogance and the smugness to look down at her and then go back to your life and not care, to maybe pretend to care about these issues for the 5-minute segment you do on Rachel Dolezal and say, oh, it's such a shame how much she set back, the fight against police brutality. and then go on and never do anything about it in your own life and say, well, it's such a shame that she set the cause back, though. Not like me. I've never set the cause back. I haven't done anything for the cause, never will, but at least I didn't set the cause back.